There is a new paper out from the World Inequality Lab, and it makes a really provocative claim about modern India. They're calling it the Billionaire Raj. So today, we're going to break down their findings on income and wealth inequality over the last 100 years. Let's jump right in.
Right out of the gate, the paper drops a bombshell. It says that the level of inequality in India today, what the authors are calling the billionaire Raj, is actually worse than it was under British colonial rule. That is a huge statement, right? So let's dig into the numbers they're using to back this up.
And here it is, the core statistic. In the most recent data available, the top 1% of earners in India took home 22.6% of the entire national income. I mean, that's the highest level it's been in over 100 years, basically since they started keeping track back in 1922.
So that brings us to Section 1, the new billionaire Raj. Let's unpack what this term actually means. And, why the authors chose such a loaded title to describe India's economy today. But a number that high makes you wonder, how did India even get to this point? To really understand what's happening now, we've got to look back. And that takes us right into Section 2, a century of inequality. This timeline really tells a dramatic story. At independence in 1947, the top 1% held about 13% of the income. For the next few decades, that share actually fell, hitting a low point of just over 6% in 1982. But then, after the economic liberalization of 1991, it's just this steep, uninterrupted climb to today's record high of 22.6%. It's a complete U-turn. So, what was going on during that great decline? Well, the paper points to socialist-inspired policies. You have to picture a very different economy. Major government control, nationalizing industries, and really, really high taxes on the rich. At one point, the top tax rate was an incredible 97.5%. These policies essentially put a ceiling on how much wealth the top earners could really build up. And then everything changed. We get to the sharp rise. In the early 90s, India opened up its economy to the world. And while this unleashed a lot of growth, it also completely supercharged the fortunes of those at the very top. As you can see, this was the beginning of a 30-year surge where wealth just got more and more concentrated. The rules of the game changed, and so did the outcome. Okay, so with all that history in mind, we can now look at the present day. Section 3. Who gets what? Let's take a closer look at exactly how India's economic pie is being sliced up right now. This chart reveals a pretty stark imbalance. The top 10% of the population, they're taking home almost 58% of the national income. The middle 40% gets about 27%, and that leaves the entire bottom half of the population with just 15% of the pie. And if you think that's something, just wait till we look at wealth, property, stocks, things people own. The picture gets even more extreme. The top 10% owns 65% of the country's total assets. The middle 40% hold about 28%, while the bottom 50% of the population is left with just under 7%. Half the people own a tiny, tiny slice of the national wealth. To make this a little less abstract, just look at the actual numbers. The average annual income for the bottom 50% is around 71,000 rupees. For the middle 40%, it's 165,000. But for the top 10%, it's over 1.3 million rupees. And the wealth gap is even wider. It's not just a gap, really. It's like we're looking at three completely different countries living inside of one.
And if we zoom in on that very, very top, the top 1%, the gap just becomes a chasm. The average person in this elite group earns 23 times more than the average Indian. 23 times. That's a simple multiplier that just perfectly captures how extreme this concentration is.
Okay, so these numbers are staggering on their own, but how do they stack up globally? That brings us to Section 4, India on the world stage.
This chart really puts things in perspective. India's top 1% income share, sitting at 22.6%, is higher than in places like Brazil and South Africa, countries that are known for having high inequality. In fact, the paper concludes that by this measure, India is among the most unequal countries in the entire world. The comparison with China is particularly interesting. Both countries have grown incredibly fast, but China's growth seems to have been distributed a bit more evenly. Their top income shares have stabilized, while India's just keep climbing. The big takeaway here is that extreme inequality isn't an automatic result of growth. It often comes down to policy choices.
All right, all of this data paints a pretty worrying picture.
So what can actually be done about it? That's what we'll explore in our final section, What's Next for India?
Now, before we get to solutions, the authors add a really critical note of caution. They argue that the quality of economic data in India has actually declined recently, which makes it harder to track this stuff accurately. And the implication is kind of chilling. As bad as these numbers look, they might actually be a conservative estimate. The reality could be even worse.
So what can be done? The authors propose a few policy levers. First, a super tax on the wealthiest individuals. Second, a bigger restructuring of the tax system to look at both income and wealth. And third, and this is the crucial part, to use that new revenue to fund massive public investments in areas like education and health, which could broaden the base for economic opportunity.
And to put that into perspective, the paper calculates that a modest 2% tax on the net wealth of just the 162 richest families in India could generate 0.5% of the entire national income. That is a game-changing amount of money that could be used for massive investments in education and health.
And so we end where the paper leaves us, with a final powerful question. Inequality in India is at a historic peak, higher even than during the colonial British Raj. The authors ask whether policy can actually reshape this trajectory before such extreme levels of inequality lead to major social and political upheaval. It's a question that hangs over India's future and one we are all left to ponder.